Welcome to the Salience Podcast, where we identify what stands out from all the noise.
Today on the Salience Podcast, we do a deep dive into culture and child safety in institutions. Today's topic could be raw or triggering for some listeners. I encourage you to continue listening, though as always, there's a fine line between having an appropriate emotional response, perhaps one that signals you to take action, and the sort of signal that lets you know that you should probably tap out and get some support to process your lived experiences. Choose wisely, folks. We're going to be talking about child sex predators, and I'm going to explore some of the techniques that professionals use to protect themselves from vicarious trauma. So there are practical insights for frontline workers as well. Our guest today is Jaqui Allen. Jaqui is a lawyer by training, and for the past decade or so has been working in various government organisations supporting people and culture. As part of Jacqui's work, she has led investigations into misconduct, and this is never an easy topic to manage, especially in a bureaucracy. Donald Trump famously stated that he could kill someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose votes. There's often a similar saying in the Australian state and federal government: it's near impossible to sack underperformers, and there is often a reluctance to take action on poor behaviour or even blatant breaches of the code of conduct. I think in the last few years this has started to change, and here in Tasmania, for example, there has been a high-profile commission of inquiry into child sexual abuse in institutional settings, and Jaqui was involved in that process. The commission of inquiry is ongoing and the findings are on public record, so I'm not going to cover those findings here. There are a number of reasons I wanted to talk to Jaqui, though, on the broader topic of culture and child safety. I've worked with Jaqui, and in the course of our conversations, I realised that she makes sense of the world in some fairly unique ways. She has an exceptional memory, and at the same time is able to manage her memories in ways that are protective to her. She's able to process very disturbing cases of child abuse and not take on other people's trauma vicariously. Jaqui is also very focused on evidence in her work, and this is critical, of course, to both protect children from abuse in institutions and also to protect workers from false claims and allegations. So in today's discussion, I'm going to focus on evidence, and I want to explore the concept of weak signals, culture and safety. And I want to unpack a little of how Jaqui thinks and shields herself from vicarious trauma. Welcome, Jaqui.
Hello.
Before we get going into the nitty-gritty of child sexual abuse in institutions, which is a pretty heavy-hitting topic, I'd like to know a little bit more about your own journey. Long before you're a lawyer, what experiences helped shape your thinking? I'm thinking about things like pivots or tipping points in your life that led you to where you are now.
I guess my background is, when I think of my childhood, I think it's pretty lucky. I grew up in Launceston where I had a rather large extended family. Not many people can say they were in the same grade as two of their cousins. And I think that provides for quite a unique childhood when you've got over 20-something cousins and a huge extended family. In addition to that, I think I'm really lucky. I've got a really close group of friends that I have had since pre-kindy. And not a lot of people can say that they have had their best friends for 30 plus years, but that's part of what makes me, I guess. But I grew up with parents who were small business owners, and in a slightly unusual upbringing, I think, had a pub, which then turned into a restaurant. And again, not many people can walk into their parents' pub and see their grade 4 teacher there very inebriated, and he'd just let people cut, or other teachers cut, his brand new Levi jeans off into shorts that weren't equal in length either. But it was the local pub, I guess, where my teachers would go and drink. But yeah, definitely quite a unique upbringing. Hospitality, though, I think hospitality is great, and it's really given me, I guess, the foundations for my later career. Hospitality, you get to meet people from all walks of life. Every day is different. You get taught important life skills such as the ability to multitask or to process information and make decisions quickly, time management, but also how to deal with uncomfortable situations. How do you deal with a drunk patron? How do you deal with a person that looks like they might just go out the door and not pay their bill? Those types of things as well. So yeah, I guess that's a big part of who I am, is having that small business background and hospitality. But in terms of tipping points, I guess, or pivots, there's probably a couple. An incident that took my blinkers off, I guess, in terms of the world, because I've sort of spoken about, I guess, my childhood and having a big extended family and I guess big support networks as well. But had an incident in my childhood when I was in grade 6, and on a Friday and Saturday night when my mum and dad were at the pub, I would receive these phone calls from a male caller, and they were quite explicit in what they would talk about, sexually explicit. And they were just a nuisance. I didn't really think much of it. I thought it was a guy down the road playing a prank on me, really. But one day, one of Dad's childhood friends came into the pub and disclosed that his daughter had been receiving sexually explicit phone calls, and it turned out it was one of their mutual friends. And that's when we all put the pieces together and realised it was probably not as how we'd all been thinking it was. And this guy was ultimately... the federal police got involved, or were involved by this stage when we became involved, and he was charged and convicted and sentenced. But it's definitely, I guess, I was in grade 6 going into grade 7, and still remember standing at the top of the staircase. Mum had sent me down to bring the clothes in off the line, and listening to the 2 federal police after I'd provided my statement say to Mum, just don't let her out of your sight for a little while. Make sure you know where she is at all times. When you sort of realise, oh, this might be a little bit more serious than what everyone's led me to believe. So, yeah, that's probably, I guess, one incident that really took my blinkers off in terms of the world around me and adults as well. I guess people that you trust. And especially because, as I said, I had quite an idyllic childhood. The teachers I had as babysitters would come up and babysit me at nights because they were also working shifts at the pub. So definitely, I guess, the incident that took my blinkers off in terms of trusting adults. And yeah, another pivotal, I guess, tipping point was my parents separated when I was in my very late teens. It wasn't so amicable, but for me that probably meant that I was ready to leave the safety of Launceston and all the support network that I've talked about and take that step out into the big wide world, and became an exchange student for a year over in France. And for those of you who have been exchange students or know the French people, they're not always the most welcoming of people. So that was probably, I would still say, probably the most challenging year of my life. I've had some that have come close, but that was still probably it. And yeah, they were probably two big things that shaped me and how I am.
I think the learnings that we can all get from working in hospitality are priceless. I really think that all young people should work in hospitality. Yeah. If it doesn't teach you empathy and understanding and something about managing difficult situations, and as you say, multitasking, dealing with drunks, people looking to duck out without paying, what incredible life skills. Very difficult, of course, to get those in school. And then you've got this person who was thankfully caught phoning you up, sexually explicit phone calls. And I think there's 2 things that strike me there. The first is how fortunate you were that came to light. These things can often be the leading edge of something that becomes far more sinister or even fatal down the track. So I think very fortunate there. There's something else I reflect on as well, and a lot of interviewers and a lot of people often ask a question that goes something like this, and they say, how did that make you feel? Now, of course, I don't buy that at all. Nothing makes you feel anything. You've got enormous choice in how you reflect and what you take from that. So I'm going to phrase the question more precisely. What did you learn from that specifically that you've carried forward?
Probably my resilience. And that's one of the reasons we're here today. And that's why I thought it important probably to share that. Yeah, it is probably my resilience. Life kept on going, and you keep on going with it. And I don't know, I was then into grade 7 and moving schools, how St. Pat's worked, where I went to school, up into a new school and things like that. Like everything just sort of kept going. It was just something that had happened almost in the background. And you reflect on it when something like you get a question like this, but I honestly don't think it had not detrimental impact, I guess, as you say. Like I see resilience as probably something positive from it. I'm generally a pretty positive glass half full type person. It was just sort of one of those things. We dealt with it, pretty much moved on from it. It is, though, it's little things, though, that something like that will impact, I think, a person. And when you've got your own children, especially something like that, will cause you to think twice a lot in your parenting journey. So, yeah, there's definitely impacts.
Yeah, there's learning. You'd learn to detect patterns. You become more acutely aware of what the risks are. I think when we talk about trauma, it's really important that we acknowledge that there's not a causation between something that happens and our response. Our response might be entirely reasonable in the moment, and we can still change our response as we travel through time with it. In your case, you didn't have a strong negative response at the time, and you took learning from that experience. You apply it now for your own children, and it's also helped set you up with resilience for some very, very demanding work. And I want to explore that a little bit more now. I want to think a little bit more about workplace culture and child safety. I mean, perpetrators, predators, are usually very good at choosing their victims. They choose a context that they can exploit. They appear to intuitively know when and how to exploit systems and weaknesses in culture. They're like magicians almost in their ability to deceive. Now, you've got a long career as a lawyer, as an investigator. What is the relationship between workplace culture and child safety in institutions from your perspective?
I found this question really interesting because I think there's almost two sides of it. I think there's people that are opportunistic, will not necessarily plan something out, but just see an opportunity and take it, probably not even think it through. And I think some situations fall into that. But more often than not, it's the situations where people have spent a long time getting the trust of others around them, understanding the system, the organisation, where its weaknesses are, and understanding that probably the people that they are going to target. That's why I sort of think that there's people that will just opportunistic, but a lot of the time I think it's people that spend time learning about a particular place. And I think that's what we've learned through listening to people's stories in the Commission of Inquiry and things like that. What's really struck me through all of this is the difficulty that a lot of the colleagues are having their colleagues named up, I guess, or have allegations against them, because they cannot imagine Joe Blow, who they have worked with for 20 years, who they've had around their children, could do such a thing. But I think if we've learned anything through all of these types of things, through the Commission of Inquiry, through the Royal Commission, it's exactly those situations that these types of things occur in. And it's really hard. It would be really hard to have to work with someone day in, day out, and then have them accused, I guess, of these types of behaviour. And that, I guess, that's something that organisations will struggle with.
Mm. I want to go back to some of the evidence you've seen where you've had to weigh up the case against somebody. I'm guessing, and please correct me if this is not the right way to think about it, I'm guessing that sometimes there's clearly no evidence. Sometimes there's clearly an overwhelming body of evidence that's super clear, and then somewhere in the middle there's a bunch of grey stuff, which is much more tricky. Can you tell me about the nature of evidence?
I'm going to have to be very careful about what I say here, because we've got a number of investigations that are ongoing. And I'm no longer involved in those investigations, but I wouldn't want to say anything that would potentially hinder those investigations. So the difficulty, I guess, that we have, a lot of these are historic matters, and evidence probably hasn't been kept or maybe slim. And when you say we have to look at on the balance of probabilities, and my role, I guess, in people and culture is I'm not the decision maker. We prepare the information for the decision maker, who's usually the head of agency, and it's our role to get all of that information together for them to be able to make a decision, firstly as to whether or not they can investigate. So they have to make the decision as to whether or not there's enough information to proceed with an investigation, but then further down the track, after an investigation has occurred, whether or not there's enough information to make findings of fact, and whether those findings of fact would lead to, in the state service, what is a breach of our code of conduct. And that can sometimes be really difficult as well, because you have a set code of conduct when some of these actions, I guess, or allegations don't neatly fit into. So you're saying, for instance, on this date, Joe Blow may have done something inappropriate with a child, which meant they didn't act with due care and diligence. People sort of look at the fact and go, that fact alone should be enough, but we have to make that connection with the code of conduct.
I want to dive a bit deeper. I appreciate that this is still ongoing and that there's certain things that you can't say, but I'm looking for generic patterns of behaviour here as an alert to us all in systems. And you mentioned two possibilities or two distinct predators, perpetrators. There's the opportunistic. They're not really thinking about it, but they see an opportunity. And then there's the longer-term strategic grooming. Let's go to opportunistic first. Are there any kind of behaviours or patterns that we might want to be alert for in our workplace or in our community or even in our extended family network? What would you be alert to? Is it eye contact? Is it being friendly? What is it?
You once said something to me that resonated with me. So I'm going to turn this back onto you. You're going to be like, oh, what's she going to say here? But the spidey sense. And you explained it to me in a way that really made sense to me, given the background that I've just explained, and that's working in hospitality. You see the nuances in body language or the little bit of a change. And I think we've previously spoken about family violence victims and how they can just see the slightest change in a face or something, and they will be instantly alert, or because that's the environment in which they've had to survive. And that probably is something that's resonated with me. People need to trust that spidey sense.
Yeah.
Or listen to it at least. Yeah.
In most of the survivors that I've worked with, they've had a very, very strong spidey sense that something wasn't right before it happened. And it can be all sorts of things. It can be, usually it's something that's different. At the level of patterns, one example might be adults asking children for help. Usually children ask adults for help. It's not the other way around. And that can be a real red flag. Adults acting as friends rather than adults and having a blurred boundary. Over familiarity, touching in a playful way. So there's all sorts of stuff there for that opportunistic red flag. But you're right. And I think encouraging our workers to be alert to anomalies. Is there somebody that's a bit odd that you might not feel comfortable about, even if it's just a little bit of something? And then what do you do about that? I mean, I'll go there first, and then I want to cycle back to this more systemic, this more insidious grooming type pattern of behaviour. If somebody's in a workplace and they've got a spidey sense, what can they do about it?
They can talk to people. And this is where, culture starts from the top. We know that. A child-safe organisation, it's not just having the policies and procedures in place. It's really that the communication between management and its people that needs to occur. And we need to educate our people to understand, to recognise, to respond. And we can do that in a variety of ways, especially people and culture. You've got inductions, workshops, training programs, all of that. But you have to demonstrate a culture of openness and courage, not to be afraid to speak up, to have that conversation with someone. To question the response that people always give, I guess, especially when you're new in an organisation. Oh, but that's the way that we've always done things. Or that's just the way they are. Challenge it. And you don't have to be rude in how you do it, but you can question it and you can ask for more information or, just be prepared to speak up. We need to create that culture that will enable disclosures, whether that be from our people, in that our employees, or whether that be from victims, or it just has to be that culture of openness and making those disclosures.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest dangers that I see in culture is where there's a culture of fear. We look at insights and collect narratives in organisations, and one question we ask is, does your story of this workplace or an event in this workplace reflect a sense of threat? And most people, more than half, say yes, it does. And then when you say, well, where is your sense of threat? Is it from, and we change the apices of a triangle here, and it's either the prisoners or the enemy or patients or people in community or public, whatever it might be, or managers or co-workers. Most often people have a sense of threat from managers or co-workers, not so much from the patients in the case of, say, a hospital. And when that happens, this ability to speak up becomes dampened, and it becomes a material risk to patients, children in institutions. So for me, this is critical. If you can say, hey, I've got an uneasy feeling about something you can't put your finger on, but you can at least have a conversation with your manager and say, I don't know what's going on here, but my spidey sense says there's something not quite right. That's your safety net. You can't prescribe this. You can't have a tick list for it. It's subtle, and often it comes from people like yourself that have had a lived experience, usually as a child. Now that sets you up with pattern recognition very, very early. You start scanning for risk, and I think this is key. I think this is absolutely crucial.
I think the problem is, though, people want to create the checklist and they want to create the process in a system where you're not necessarily going to be able to. And that's what people are looking for. Well, give me the checklist that I can go through so I know in my mind that I've done everything possible. Or when, we're talking about, I guess, an environment where you can't necessarily, there's no rule book necessarily for some of this stuff. And that's what makes it really difficult.
And I think if there's one checklist I'd put in, it would be, as a manager, have I created an environment of psychological safety that allows these conversations to come forward? Yes or no? If I can tick that one, then I've created the conditions that will alert me to everything else. And if I've got work to do in that area, then I need to get onto that as probably my number one priority. Just on this idea of patterns and going back to the more systemic, have you seen anything or heard anything that you could articulate as a pattern of behaviour around grooming? How does it happen? What happens in institutions? What could alert us?
I mean, you can start to see patterns in types of allegations in things that will be used. So, for instance, it might be that a threat that they would not let someone use the phone and have their phone calls with their family, or would give a reward for doing something. So for a sexual act, would give cigarettes and things like that. So there's definitely, you can get information come across your desk and definitely go, I've seen that enough times before in other allegations from other individuals that have had no crossover in terms of they weren't a resident at the same time, or you definitely look at it and go, I've just heard that before. And it resonates with you. I've heard it many times before. And it's not even so much a belief, I guess, but you can definitely go, well, I've heard it before, unfortunately. And again, a lot of the things I read are ways of abuse that occurred in that way. I mean, another example that I have is I get to read these things, and it's funny, people don't necessarily think one of the things I've spoken about amounts to abuse. And this was how strip searches occurred and cavity searches. And me reading that, I know that that's inappropriate. But the person that may have written that in a claim form or in a civil litigation matter, they don't necessarily actually think that that's the wrongdoing that's occurred in their complaint, because they have been led to believe that that's just something to be expected, or it's just something that occurs, which is almost it's a bit sad, really, in a way.
Yeah, I guess what we've got there systemically as well that relates to what you've just said is that when people are busy, and there's nowhere near enough frontline workers in these fields, it's very, very hard to recruit, very, very hard to retain good people, because it's such challenging work. And of course, they're always exposed to allegations of this nature, even if they're absolutely legitimate. So it is a high-risk workplace. You have to protect yourself as well as your clients' children. And I think one of the challenges that when people are working under such immense pressure is that it's very difficult to build in checks and balances, so that you're checking procedures, you're cross-referencing people's experience across multiple professional providers, if you like. And I think that can be a real challenge. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that it fundamentally boils down to threats and rewards. Really, if there's this threat that if you tell, there'll be these consequences, or you won't get this or you won't get that, and then there's these rewards, whatever that might be, time, place, cigarettes, treats, whatever. And I think there's some interesting challenges there to be able to separate out that subtle, I'm going to call it the weak signals. This is the subtle changes, the difference between being friendly and professional and being friendly and nefarious. Like you say, the spidey sense is critical. I wonder too if there's anything around being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Just subtle stuff where you go, actually, what was that person doing there right then? Is that something you've come across?
Definitely something we've come across, and probably something that might not necessarily be in a role description for that particular person in their particular role. Why were they conducting or doing that? Or definitely see that as well. And I should say, you mentioned it before, and I guess I just want to stress it at this particular point in time, there are some amazing people that choose to work in these types of environments, and not typecasting everyone or not saying that everyone. It really is, I think, a minority of people, and that's probably what makes it hard, because a lot of people go into this with the right intentions. They really want to make a difference. They've probably come from their own backgrounds that may have trauma, or that they have a particular calling to work with certain people and things like that. And then they're faced in almost in a situation, an environment where they themselves are cast in doubt, and their integrity or their reasons for doing this type of work, etc., are called into question. So I think that's sort of something really important to highlight, that there are really, really good people that are doing some amazing work, which probably makes this harder when you have to operate where it almost creates distrust, I guess, between colleagues and things like that when you have this type of thing occurring. It can be really hard. These are really hard environments in which to operate.
Yeah, absolutely. This is where I want to go now. And I've got a metaphor that came to me with many years ago. I had an executive coach, and I was struggling with some conflict in a team. And we were sat in a coffee shop, and there was a jug of water. And she said, "Look at that jug of water." And she said, "Now imagine you put in one drop of ink. What happens to the jug of water?" And it really brought it home for me that one drop of ink can colour the entire experience. And I think that's what we're talking about here. The overwhelming majority of people are there for the right reasons, and they do an incredibly professional job under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And then there's the drop of ink. And I want to unpack a couple of things that you do now for those people, those amazing people that do have a calling here. They often do have a background of their own trauma that they've had to work through so that they can protect others, that they understand, the importance of this sort of work. And this might be a little bit of a deep dive. I mentioned earlier that you've got a good memory. In fact, it's nearly eidetic. You've got great ability to store information that are somewhat quirky. I think they're very unique. I'd like you to imagine for a moment a case that you have worked on. I don't want you to share the nature of the case, not the who, the what happened, but step us through what you do with images and narratives, what you read in the case notes, what you've seen in pictures. What is it that you do as you're accessing this kind of really very challenging material?
Yeah. And I was going to give an example, I guess, of a child sexual abuse matter and getting a proof of evidence from a victim, because I've worked also as a lawyer, and part of that was working with child sexual abuse victims and in victims of crime situations. But probably actually use another example, because people could probably picture this more. And it was a case where it was an MAIB matter, Motor Accident Insurance Board, and we were acting on behalf of the plaintiffs. And part of that work involved going down to see the coroner's file. And you can just imagine the types of images that are on that file. Now, I can take myself to the coroner's office in my mind, and I'll talk to you now. I could take myself to sitting at the table, and I can see the colour of the file. And I know what are on those photos, and they're pretty gruesome. There's a reason that the file's at the coroner's office, but I'm not going to open that door, because that's not going to help anyone. And so that's probably my best technique, I guess, is that I do have the ability to recall a lot of memories. I drive my husband and my family crazy, I guess, with just my memory, because I can often say to win an argument, but you were here and you were doing this and this was happening, and I've got all the facts to bring in. And yeah, you have to choose, I guess, when you have a memory like that, as to what door you're going to open. And I can do that with so many cases, especially with personal injury litigation. So we often acted on behalf of plaintiffs, and personal injury litigation is really personal. You have to find out what the impact was on them personally. And you have to go into whether it be accidents or workplace injuries, how things occurred, but also what the impact was on their personal lives, professionally. And for a lot of those, you just have to put up that barrier. You can't let yourself go past it in your mind, because I think if you do, that's when you start to go into the areas of vicarious trauma. And there'll be those cases that that will resonate with you. And I've got a couple. There's one where a girl who was only a couple of years younger than I was travelling a road that I'd often travelled as a teenager, because she was a teenager when this happened. And we had so many similarities. We'd gone to the same high school, we'd gone to the same college, university, that type of thing. But you just can't sometimes can't go past, because I think it would overwhelm people. Yeah, it's not avoidance. I don't think, like, it's still there, but that's probably the main way I operate. Likewise with a lot of allegations and things that you hear, like you can go down, and I could recall the nitty-gritty and the details of child sexual abuse that occurred with certain individuals and things like that, but I'm just not going to go there, really.
So let me make this explicit, that you've got a great memory. In the case of the example you gave of the motor accident, you could, in your mind, take yourself down to the coroner's office, and you could imagine the file there. And if you chose to open it, you'd be able to see the photographic images and the narrative and the information. So if you were needed in a coronial, you could give evidence, but you'd have to deliberately go in your mind and specifically access that information to relay it. And then presumably you'd close the files and walk away and leave it there.
Yeah.
Correct? And what happens when you're hearing a narrative? Let's say you're interviewing a victim of abuse, and you're hearing the narrative. You might be taking notes. What happens to that narrative? Is it like being filed on a tape recorder, or does it go onto notes on the paper that you then leave alone? Do you create images at the same time? What do you do?
It's all of the above. And I think that's what I've explained before when trying to work with you previously around some things. It's all of the senses, and it's almost overwhelming. In that you can see, like I can see the picture of someone sitting in my office, but I'm writing down it as well. So it's the recollection of all of that. And you could probably go, okay, well, what was I wearing? And you can feel, so you're involving like all the senses, and then you can start to smell the office. It's everything that you can you draw on all of those things to bring it back if you need to. So yeah, it's not just, I guess, a photographic memory in a way, but it's everything. It's part of memory.
Yeah, great. I am deliberately here creating the conditions for vicarious trauma. This is how people create vicarious trauma in themselves. They engage their senses, the narratives, the sounds and the images, and they recreate the felt sensations in their body. That, at its essence, is vicarious trauma. What's important here is by knowing how you can get it, you know how not to get it. You can disentangle that. You can create something like a memory palace. It's where you can take images, narratives, notes, and you can put them in files, but you can choose to access them. You don't travel with them except for the brief moments when you need them professionally. Is that correct?
That's correct.
There's something that we teach people, and you might not need to do this because it might be so automatic for you. Let's say you've been working, you're in an office, you've had a hard day doing some of this sort of stuff, and you've filed everything away. Do you ever check before you leave the building or before you go home that you have safely filed those experiences away and that you're not traveling with them?
As you said, it's probably automatic. And I've got a few ways in which I do it. It's really good. I think like one of my favourite things to do is probably call someone on the way home. Not about what I've just dealt with, not at all. But it's almost that demarcation line between home and work. My difficulty is, I guess home, and I've got 2 young children, so I jump straight into mum mode. But I do find I find it a lot more difficult to jump straight into mum mode when I'm on the phone with someone from work right up to my front door. I find that little bit of time helps. But then there are other things, especially probably over the last 18 months, that I've done in relation to my own well-being. There's some things I'll do and I won't do. So, for instance, I won't watch a scary movie or a movie where I won't watch Law and Order or any of those types of shows. I wouldn't risk almost, not the triggering, but it's not enjoyable. I don't see scaring myself as enjoyable. I read a lot, but I read for pleasure. And I probably read what a lot of people would be quite surprised, not quite Mills and Boon, but I'll read the current sort of literature, I guess, and I'll challenge myself, but I enjoy reading fiction and find that's a really good, it really helps me, especially between sleep, like to get to sleep and around there. lots of walks with podcasts. Again, put the kids to bed, get in the right frame of mind to go to sleep. And I'm generally a pretty good sleeper, is to go for that walk around the block or something like that, which again adds as that other resilience or well-being trigger. And very honest, like I'm struggling not, obviously I'm been open. I'm recovering from back surgery, and I'm struggling not being able to do the same things that I would usually do to cope with certain situations and stresses in life and things like that. I'm missing going to the gym in the morning and doing my boxing classes, or going for my walks around the block and listening to podcasts and things like that. So I'm very mindful that I've got to probably come up with some new ways of unwinding. I haven't watched TV in years, but I'm currently watching Wednesday with the 8-year-old son and my husband and things like that. So whilst I haven't watched TV in so long. I'm the worst person when it comes to talking about TVs and movies with. Netflix just skipped me by, but getting into some more TV shows, because you need those things outside of work to be able to look forward to and to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are many aspects of culture like TV that have also passed me by. I can sometimes go for years without ever looking at it, which might surprise people. I mean, I'm going to recap in a moment on some of the amazing things that you do to stay well. And you've talked about a few changes there that you're having to adapt on the basis of back surgery. I want to cycle back before we do that, and I just want to round off on this idea of culture. You've been working in culture and people for more than a decade now, and I've been fishing for weak signals, red flags, those things that we need to pay attention to. And I'm interested in any aspects of culture that you're paying attention to, either that you're encouraging, or what are you encouraging less of, or for holding the line with?
Again, it goes back to that openness and that courage, being prepared to speak up and to question. Well, why haven't we looked at that? Why haven't we asked more questions in relation to that? That's probably the biggest one. Creating that culture that then enables, the disclosures or the questioning of behaviours and things like that. The openness. Yeah,
the openness. You mentioned earlier about the ability to speak up and articulate the spidey sense. When we began, you talked about the life skills that you learnt from hospitality, the multitasking, the dealing with difficult situations like drunks or people trying to bunk out without paying. You talked about the resilience that you got from the events of having somebody phone in with explicit phone calls when you were a young girl in year 6, 7. And then you talked about developing that spidey sense and the importance of spidey sense in organisations. Being able to speak up, which is what we're talking about now, where you want to draw people's attention to that. We identified 3, or in fact there were several ways that you protect yourself doing very, very difficult work. One way was that you use your memory very deliberately. I'll call it broadly a memory palace. This is where you place memories in certain rooms or certain locations, and you only access them when you need to access them. They're there, and it's important for people to recognise that you haven't deleted them. You've not buried them. You've not pretended they're not there. You just created a construct that's safe so that they don't come out when they're not needed. You can access them if you need to, but you don't when you don't. You have a demarcation line, going home, calling a friend, so that when you get home with family and children, you're not carrying any of that sort of stuff with you. Something else that you do, which is really interesting, you've got exquisite skills in the way that you hear narrative, deal with images, but you don't overwhelm your input channels. You don't watch horror, you don't go home and dip into Law and Order. In fact, you read fiction and give yourself a rest from that. And I think this is something that people forget. Exercising these skills sometimes is somewhat energetic. It takes effort. For me, it does take effort. And I can't overwhelm myself all day long with the same sorts of challenge. I have to have a certain amount which I know I can cope with. And I listen to my body, really. It's a felt sensation that goes, whoa, that's enough of that. Working with people who are suicidal is a good example. I've usually got room for 1 or 2 of those folks in my life, but I don't want my whole life. It can be all consuming. It can really take over and be quite time demanding. So that's my recap on both what you've brought from your early days, what you've learnt, where your attention is, what you do that's so unique and so fantastic around preventing vicarious trauma. And I'd just like to end with one last question. What are your future aspirations, either work or elsewhere in your life?
Oh, and I think we've spoken about this before. I prescribe to a bit of a four burners theory in life, that you can't always have all four burners going. The burners being work, family, health, and friends. And sometimes saying that a person can have it all and have all four burners going all at once can, I think, lead to unhappiness, really, because you're like, well, why can't I? If they can, why can't I? And sometimes in life you don't necessarily get a choice in which burner to turn up, but sometimes it's really nice to have that choice in which burner to turn up. And this year, for example, I didn't get a choice into turning up the work burner. And also at the end of the year, the health burner has had to be turned up. But next year, I probably want to choose to turn the work burner up in a way that I'm choosing, that someone's not necessarily choosing for me. Health is going to be something that I'm going to just have to do, but probably is going to be turning up more of that family and friends burner, which I maybe not have not had turned up for the last year or so, and making those connections again. So, yeah, I just sort of, especially I think the New Year's a really good time to think about what burners you might turn up consciously, appreciating that sometimes you don't always get the choice, but yeah, I'm just going to make the conscious decision to turn up some more of those burners next year. Yeah, hopefully it might include a holiday or something, but yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. What a great interview. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Salience Podcast. Please leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Frontline Mind newsletter by visiting our website at frontlinemind.com. Have you got a topic you would like some more salience on? Send us a message on LinkedIn or email team@frontlinemind.com.